Cops beat pregnant Gina O'Kelly into a coma, unaware that her husband was Chuck Norris. What he did next, they will never forget. Watch until the end and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. The morning sun fell gently across the windows of the Norris home in Los Angeles, laying warm stripes of gold across the hardwood floors. It was the kind of morning that asked nothing of anyone, quiet and kind, where even the breeze that came in from the balcony doors smelled of promise and the distant salt of the ocean. Inside, the house was alive with small sounds. A kettle singing its soft song, the low creak of stairs as Gina O'Kelly Norris moved slowly, her hand resting on the curve of her stomach, feeling the reassuring weight of the life growing inside her. She paused at the window, looking out into the backyard where the trees moved slightly, and for a moment she closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the day rest on her face, feeling the baby turn gently, a reminder of hope and the future she and Chuck had dreamed of building together. The kitchen smelled of coffee and toasted bread, a comfortable domestic aroma that wrapped around Gina as she moved, carefully, avoiding the quick motions she used to make before the baby came to be. She was in the later months now, and every step was a mindful, gentle negotiation with her body. She did not complain, nor did she allow herself to sink into fear, even when the nights were restless, and her body felt heavy with uncertainty. Gina was, and always had been, a woman of quiet courage, a calm and enduring presence that even Chuck, with all his iron discipline and long years of controlled strength, found grounding. On the counter lay a handwritten list of errands, small, ordinary things: fresh fruit, a particular type of herbal tea she had begun to favor, a pack of baby socks that she had seen on sale at the corner shop. It was a day for small tasks, a day for normalcy. Chuck moved quietly through the house as he always did in the mornings, his footsteps measured, the slight rustle of fabric as he completed a set of stretches in the living room, maintaining the rituals that had shaped his life long before he was known to the world. Even in the calm, there was focus in his movements, a latent power kept in check, his breathing steady as he completed his forms, each motion precise. He looked up to see Gina watching him, her eyes warm with that smile that belonged to mornings like this, the smile that told him she was there, fully with him, even when words were unnecessary. They shared a brief moment in the doorway, Gina reaching up to place a hand on his cheek as he leaned down to press a kiss to her forehead, the moment tender and quietly fierce, as if it contained all the vows they had ever spoken to one another. His hand rested for a moment on her belly, feeling the light kick of the baby beneath his palm, a small miracle that made even a man like Chuck Norris, who had known war and loss and triumph, pause and simply breathe. "Be safe," he murmured, and Gina smiled, a small, reassuring smile that told him she would. She always did. She left with the careful, slow grace of a woman who carried life within her, waving once before closing the door, and Chuck stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle around him before turning back to his training, the house quiet once again. The drive was calm, the roads surprisingly clear for Los Angeles at that hour, and Gina let herself enjoy the simplicity of it, the lightness of being alone with her thoughts and the soft music playing from the speakers. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw herself, hair pulled back, face open and calm, and she thought about the crib they had ordered, the tiny clothes folded neatly in drawers, the hope she had for the baby to grow up in a world that was kinder, safer. She was determined to be a mother who would teach strength and compassion, the same traits that had made her fall in love with Chuck years ago when their paths first crossed. She pulled into the small parking lot of the neighborhood store, a place she liked for its familiarity, and the friendly smiles of the clerks who often recognized her. The air was warm as she stepped out, adjusting the strap of her handbag over her shoulder, feeling the slight pull in her lower back as she straightened, taking a breath before walking toward the entrance. She passed by a small group gathered near the sidewalk, their voices low but tense, the kind of energy that made her glance twice, seeing the worried faces of those standing close, seeing the way people shifted their weight from foot to foot, glancing nervously at two police officers standing near a young black teenager, their posture aggressive. Gina's steps slowed as she watched, her instinct to help rising quietly but firmly. She saw the boy, barely older than a child, his eyes wide, fear etched into every line of his face as one of the officers pushed him against the hood of the police car, the other officer shouting words she couldn't fully hear, but the tone was unmistakable. Sharp and hard, the sound of power being misused. Around them, people watched but did not move, the fear in their silence hanging heavy in the air. She moved closer, her hand reaching into her bag for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she unlocked it, preparing to call for help. It was not in her nature to stand by and watch. She was not looking to cause a scene. She only wanted to ensure that someone would be held accountable, that this boy would not be hurt or worse, forgotten. She started recording, keeping the phone low, her face calm, her breathing steady, trying to stay unnoticed while doing what felt right. But the officers noticed. The taller of the two turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw the phone in her hand. His face twisted into something cruel as he stepped toward her, his boots loud against the pavement. She took a step back, her hand instinctively going to her belly, her voice calm but firm as she said she was just calling for help, that she wasn't interfering, that she was just making sure no one got hurt. But the officer's face only darkened, his hand reaching for her phone, his words sharp and loud, demanding she hand it over, demanding she stop recording, calling her a troublemaker. The other officer joined him, his presence heavy with unspoken threat, and the small crowd around them grew more anxious, some pulling out their own phones, others stepping back, unwilling to get involved. Gina felt her heart beating faster, the baby moving within her as if sensing the tension, and she tried to explain again, her words tripping over each other as the officer grabbed at her phone, yanking it from her hand with enough force to make her stumble. She caught herself, one hand going to the car behind her for support, the other protectively over her stomach. She looked up into the officer's face and saw no understanding there, only anger, only the certainty of a man who believed he would never face consequences. She tried to speak, to tell him she was pregnant, to ask him to calm down, but the words were cut off as his hand came down, shoving her hard, sending her falling backward onto the hard pavement. Pain exploded in her back as she hit the ground, the air rushing out of her lungs as she tried to pull herself up, the world around her spinning, the sounds of people shouting, of the boy crying out, of the officer yelling that she was resisting, that she was interfering, that she was under arrest. She tried to speak, to say she wasn't resisting, that she was only trying to help, but before the words could form, the second officer stepped forward, his boot connecting with her side, rolling her onto her back, the shock of it making her cry out. She felt the warmth of blood before she saw it, a trickle at first, then more, warm against her skin as it spread. Her vision blurred as the pain in her head became sharp and bright, the edge of the curb rising up to meet her as she fell again, striking her temple, the world going dim around the edges. She could hear her own breath, ragged and fast, the thundering of her heart, the shouts of the crowd mixing into a single rising wave of sound. And then she felt the baby move. A sharp, desperate flutter inside her, and fear, like she had never known, filled her as darkness took her under. The officers stepped back, their faces unreadable as they looked down at her. The small crowd, now a sea of cameras and horrified expressions, but no one stepping forward. The boy was silent now, his eyes on Gina's unmoving body, his mouth open in a soundless cry. Somewhere, someone was calling for an ambulance, the high, thin wail of sirens in the distance. But for Gina, the world was already slipping away. The last thing she felt the wet warmth of her blood against the cool pavement, the last thought of Chuck's face, his hand on her belly, the promise in his eyes that she would always be safe. The paramedics arrived, moving quickly, their hands sure and practiced as they checked her pulse, calling out her condition, lifting her carefully onto a stretcher, the blood pooling beneath her, leaving a dark, stark stain on the pavement, a mark of violence and fear. The crowd parted as they wheeled her away, the police officers standing back, one of them wiping sweat from his brow, the other staring at the blood on his boots, silent and unblinking. The ambulance doors closed, the sirens wailed, and the vehicle pulled away, leaving behind the hushed crowd, the fading echo of violence hanging in the morning air. The street was quiet again, but nothing was the same. A promise of safety had been broken, and somewhere across the city, Chuck Norris would soon hear the words that would change everything, would ignite in him something he had long kept buried, something the world had forgotten could still awaken. And as the ambulance turned the corner, speeding toward Mercy General, the sun continued to rise, indifferent to the pain below, the day moving forward, unaware that for one family, everything had just shattered in the span of a breath. The sirens wailed across Los Angeles, cutting through the warm morning with their urgent, mournful cry, pulling attention from birds on telephone wires and joggers who paused, hands on hips, looking toward the flashing lights as the ambulance sped past. Inside the vehicle, Gina lay unconscious, her face pale, a line of blood crusting along her temple, her hair matted, her breathing uneven beneath the oxygen mask pressed against her lips. The paramedics worked with quick, clinical hands, calling out numbers, checking the fetal monitor strapped around her belly, eyes flicking from the readout to the woman's slack face, seeing the bruises already blooming purple across her cheek and jaw. One of them quietly muttered a prayer, his eyes closing for half a second before he returned to the motions that were all that stood between life and death. The hospital loomed ahead, a familiar building of sterile promise, the place where new life often began and where, just as often, lives ended under the cold white glow of the hallway lights. They rushed her through the emergency entrance, the wheels of the gurney squeaking on the polished floors as nurses and doctors converged, questions filling the air in short, sharp bursts. How many weeks? Was she conscious at the scene? Where was the trauma? They checked her pulse, lifted her eyelids to find unresponsive pupils, noted the swelling already rising on her skull. The fetal monitor beeped, a thin, anxious sound in the chaos, reminding everyone that 2 lives hung in the balance. They moved her quickly, efficiently, through double doors that swung closed behind them, shutting out the rest of the world, sealing Gina away in a small room filled with machines and wires, the scent of antiseptic thick in the air. They cut away her clothing, checked for fractures, for internal bleeding, for signs of life, for the faint, irregular beat of a baby who had done nothing to deserve being pulled into this brutal, chaotic world. Nurses exchanged glances over their masks, a silent conversation of worry and exhaustion and determination, the sort that filled these rooms daily but never truly became easier. Somewhere across the city, Chuck Norris was finishing his training for the morning, the heavy bag swaying from the last of his strikes, the sweat dripping from his temples, breathing in the quiet that came after focused violence. He moved with the precision of a man who had spent decades mastering the conversation between discipline and force, every movement sharp, measured, powerful. He stepped back, rolling his shoulders, letting the burn in his muscles settle into the comfort of routine. The house was quiet, sunlight creeping across the floor in gentle bands, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to think about Gina, about her laughter that morning, the way her hand had rested on his cheek, the warmth in her eyes. The ringing of the phone was sharp, abrupt, slicing through the quiet like a blade. Chuck reached for it, wiping sweat from his brow with the edge of his sleeve, pressing the phone to his ear, expecting her voice, ready to hear her talk about what tea she had chosen, or how she had found a new book for the baby's room, her voice always soft, always full of light. It was not her voice that came through the line. The words were precise, clinical, spoken by a woman whose voice carried the weight of practiced sorrow, each syllable carefully chosen to deliver news that could never be softened. There had been an incident. Gina was at Mercy General. She was in critical condition. There was a baby. There had been a trauma to the head. He needed to come immediately. Chuck did not remember hanging up the phone. The room around him went silent, everything frozen, the world narrowing to the single point of the words he had just heard. For a moment, he stood still, the air thick in his lungs, the edges of his vision darkening, and then the training that had saved his life countless times took over. He moved, calmly, deliberately, pulling a clean shirt over his shoulders, grabbing his keys, his wallet, checking for his phone, moving through the motions of a man who understood that panic was the enemy, that to lose control was to lose everything. He stepped outside, the sun blinding for a moment, the warmth meaningless against the cold that had settled into his bones. The truck roared to life, the engine a low growl beneath him as he pulled out of the driveway, the tires gripping the asphalt, carrying him toward the hospital as the world blurred around him. He did not feel the passage of the city as he drove, the traffic lights ignored, the horns of other drivers meaningless in the face of the singular mission that now consumed him. The words echoed in his mind, relentless, every second that passed another moment too long. He arrived at Mercy General, pulling into the emergency lot, the truck stopping with a jolt as he leapt out, the doors slamming behind him as he crossed the pavement in long, purposeful strides. The sliding glass doors opened to the sharp scent of disinfectant, the bright lights of the waiting room, the hushed voices of nurses moving quickly through the hallways. He approached the desk, his eyes locked onto the nurse behind it, a young woman who looked up and froze as she saw him, recognition flickering across her face. "My wife," he said, his voice low, controlled, the words heavy. "Gina Norris. I need to see her." She stammered, nodding quickly, her hands moving to the keyboard, typing, her eyes scanning the screen as she directed him toward the elevator, her voice explaining the floor, the room number, the words tumbling over each other. Chuck did not wait for her to finish, moving past her, down the hallway, the world narrowing to the corridor ahead, the lights above flickering past in a rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart. When he reached the ICU, the doors opened to a world of machines and quiet urgency, the steady beeping of monitors, the hushed conversations of nurses and doctors, the soft rustle of gowns as they moved around the beds. Gina lay in the corner of the room, surrounded by the glow of monitors, tubes running from her arms, an oxygen mask covering her face, her skin pale, almost translucent in the harsh light. The bandage around her head was stark white against the bruises that darkened her face, her hair matted and tangled, a cruel reminder of the violence that had been inflicted upon her. Chuck stopped. His breath caught in his chest, the sight of her breaking something deep within him, something that had been forged in the heat of countless battles, in the discipline of decades of control. His hands clenched at his sides, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he stepped forward, each step heavy, deliberate, until he stood beside her, looking down at the woman who had brought light into his life, who had carried their child within her, who now lay still and silent in a bed that smelled of antiseptic and fear. He reached out, his hand trembling as he brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, careful not to disturb the bandages, his fingers gentle as they traced the line of her cheek, feeling the heat of her skin, the fragile pulse beneath it. His thumb rested against her temple, the warmth of her life a small reassurance in the cold that surrounded him. He bent down, pressing his lips softly against her forehead, closing his eyes as he breathed her in, the scent of her hair, the faint hint of the shampoo she loved, the reality of her presence anchoring him in the storm that raged within. The doctor approached quietly, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a tired face, her hands folded in front of her as she explained Gina's condition in the calm, practiced tone of someone who had delivered such news too many times. A closed head injury, cerebral swelling, a medically induced coma to reduce intracranial pressure. The next 72 hours critical. Chuck listened, his eyes never leaving Gina's face, the words sinking into him, each one a weight he carried without flinching. He did not ask questions. He did not rage or weep. He simply nodded, his hand tightening around Gina's, his thumb stroking the back of her hand in slow, steady circles. He stayed there beside her as the hours passed, the light outside shifting from the brightness of afternoon to the soft glow of evening, the machines around them continuing their steady, relentless rhythm. Nurses came and went, checking monitors, adjusting IV lines, speaking in soft voices that did not disturb the fragile silence of the room. Chuck barely noticed them, his focus entirely on Gina, on the small movements of her chest as she breathed, on the occasional flutter of her fingers, on the faint warmth of her skin beneath his touch. In the quiet moments, when the room was still and the only sounds were the beeping of the monitors and the low hum of the machines, Chuck allowed himself to remember. He saw her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled when she teased him, the way her hand felt in his, the softness of her voice when she spoke to their baby, the strength she carried within her, a strength that had matched his own in ways he had never thought possible. He remembered the promise he had made to her, the vow to protect her, to keep her safe, to build a life where she could smile without fear. And in those moments, as he watched her lying there, bruised and broken, the cold fury within him grew, a fire that burned beneath the surface, controlled and precise, waiting. He did not allow it to consume him. He did not let it cloud his mind. He let it settle into him, becoming a part of him, fueling the resolve that had carried him through war zones and missions, through loss and victory, through every moment that had demanded more of him than he thought he could give. When night fell and Gina's mother arrived to sit with her, Chuck stepped out of the room, his movements deliberate, controlled, each step a promise, each breath a vow. He left the hospital, the cold night air washing over him as he walked to his truck, the city around him quiet, the lights of the buildings reflecting off the dark pavement. He drove home in silence, the streets empty, the world feeling distant, as if it belonged to another life. At home, he moved through the house, the quiet rooms filled with the memories of Gina's laughter, of the plans they had made, of the life they had built together. He went to the hall closet, reaching behind the winter coats to pull out an old, worn duffel bag, its weight familiar in his hands. He carried it to the garage, setting it down on the workbench, unzipping it to reveal the contents within. His old flight suit, carefully folded, the fabric still smelling faintly of sand and jet fuel, the patches on the sleeves a testament to a life he had once lived, a man he had once been. He lifted it, unfolding it carefully, his fingers tracing the name stitched over the chest, the call sign, Ghost, that had once been his identity, the name spoken in whispers among those who had known him, who had seen what he was capable of. He laid it across the bench, smoothing the fabric, the weight of it grounding him as he reached for the small velvet pouch tucked into the corner of the bag, opening it to reveal the silver pin, the eagle with its wings spread wide, clutching arrows, the symbol of who he had been, who he still was. He held it in his hand, staring at it, the memories flooding back, the missions, the battles, the moments when he had been the weapon, the shield, the force that others relied upon. He felt the fire within him, the cold, precise fury that had kept him alive, that had made him the man who could walk into darkness and emerge, unbroken, unyielding. And as he stood there, in the quiet of the garage, the promise of the city beyond the walls, Chuck made a silent vow to Gina, to their child, to himself. This would not stand. The world may have forgotten what he was capable of, but they would remember. He would make them remember. And he would not stop until the ones who had done this paid for every moment of pain they had caused. The night held its breath as Chuck stood in the garage, the faint hum of the city pressing against the walls, while the scent of oil and steel lingered in the cold air. He closed his hand around the pin, feeling its edges press into his palm as he placed it back into the pouch, folding the flight suit with reverence before returning it to the duffel bag. Each movement was slow, deliberate, a ritual of awakening a part of himself that he had kept quiet for years, a part that now stirred with the knowledge that Gina lay bruised and broken in a hospital bed, carrying their child within her fragile, sleeping body. The promise he had made her was alive in the fire moving through his veins, turning every thought into a blade sharpened by focus. The house was quiet, shadows stretching long across the floors as he moved through each room, checking windows, doors, the security systems that were more habit than necessity until now. Everything felt smaller in that silence. The rooms filled with the ghost of Gina's laughter, the memory of her humming in the kitchen, the softness of her touch as she adjusted a photo frame on the shelf, brushing dust away with a small, unconscious smile. He let those images live in his mind for a moment, anchoring him, reminding him what he was fighting to protect. And then he closed his eyes, drawing in a breath that filled his lungs with the promise of war. Chuck moved to his office, pulling out a small black notebook, the leather cover worn from years of use, flipping it open to the first blank page as he set it down on the desk. The pen moved across the paper with swift, precise strokes, writing down every detail he could remember from the call, the hospital, the time Gina left the house, the approximate time the attack had happened, cross-referencing it with traffic patterns and the location of the incident. He began to map out a plan, the meticulous organization of a man who understood that victory was not found in rage, but in patience, in method, in the cold calculation that would lead him to those responsible. He knew the LAPD, had trained some of its members in hand-to-hand combat during his younger years, had seen the bureaucracy that layered itself over the truth like a shroud. Chuck also knew that while the system moved slowly, leaving victims to wait for justice that never came, he did not have the luxury of waiting. Gina did not have that luxury, nor did their child. He picked up his phone and began to make calls, reaching out to old contacts, men and women who had once served beside him or trained under him, voices from the past who understood the weight in his tone, the unspoken promise that this was not a request but a mission. The hours passed in the quiet hum of planning, the soft scratching of the pen against the paper as he compiled names, addresses, shift rotations. It did not take long for the first pieces to fall into place. A friend within the force, one who owed him a favor, provided him with the names of the officers involved in the incident, 2 men who had been known for their aggression, whose disciplinary files were thick with complaints that had been buried beneath paperwork and silence. Chuck read their names over and over, letting them sink into him, letting them become a part of the rhythm of his thoughts. Officer Mitchell and Officer Carter. 2 men who had chosen to use their power to hurt an unarmed, pregnant woman who had left her bleeding on the ground and returned to their patrol as if it meant nothing. The day broke slowly, the dawn light creeping across the city as Chuck stood by the window, watching the streets below begin to fill with cars, with people moving through their lives unaware that the world had shifted. He dressed in simple, dark clothes, pulling on a jacket that allowed him freedom of movement, boots that were silent against the ground, and gloves that would protect his hands while leaving no marks. He checked the small camera attached to the inside of his jacket, ensuring it was operational, knowing that while he sought justice, he also needed evidence, needed to ensure that what was coming would be documented should it be required. He was not there to kill. He was there to send a message. He left the house quietly, locking the door behind him as he stepped into the cool morning, the air crisp against his skin, filling his lungs with the calm before the storm. The truck moved through the city streets, blending in with the morning traffic as he followed the route he had mapped out, arriving near the precinct where the officers worked. He parked a block away, observing the building, watching the comings and goings of the officers, the shift change that happened like clockwork every morning. He noted the faces, the body language, the easy arrogance of men who believed themselves untouchable. Over the next several days, Chuck began to follow them, keeping his distance, learning their habits. Officer Mitchell liked to stop by a small diner after his shift, sitting in the back booth with a coffee and a newspaper, laughing loudly as he shared stories with another officer, his voice carrying across the room, the false confidence of a man who thought he was safe. Officer Carter preferred the gym, spending hours lifting weights, boasting to others about how he handled troublemakers on the street, his hands moving in sharp, aggressive gestures that betrayed the violence simmering beneath his skin. Chuck watched, memorizing every detail, the vehicles they drove, the paths they took home, the times they were alone. Each evening, Chuck returned to the hospital, sitting beside Gina, holding her hand, speaking to her softly about the progress he was making, about the child growing inside her, about the home they would return to once she woke. The machines continued their steady rhythm, the monitors beeping softly as the nurses moved in and out, checking vitals, adjusting medication, offering sympathetic smiles that never reached their tired eyes. He stayed until the nurses gently reminded him that visiting hours were over, and even then, he would linger by the door, looking back at her, the promise of his return in his eyes. At night, he returned home to train, to prepare his body for what was to come. The garage became his sanctuary, the heavy bag swinging beneath his strikes, his breathing controlled, precise, his movements sharp and efficient. He practiced takedowns, joint locks, pressure points, the disciplines of a lifetime brought back into sharp focus by the need to protect, to reclaim the promise that had been broken. The rhythm of his strikes echoed in the darkness, each impact a reminder that he was alive, that he was ready. He spent hours reviewing the footage from his small camera, checking angles, ensuring that everything he needed would be recorded. He replayed the faces of Mitchell and Carter, their laughter, their careless movements, their cruelty, letting the images fuel the fire within him, not with rage, but with purpose. He was not a man acting out of revenge. He was a man acting out of necessity, ensuring that those who had harmed his family would never do so again. Chuck's movements in the days that followed were methodical. He followed Mitchell one evening as the officer left the diner, moving through the quiet streets toward his car. Chuck kept his distance, blending with the shadows, watching as Mitchell fumbled with his keys, glancing around with the casual arrogance of a man who had never known fear. Chuck approached him silently, his footsteps masked by the hum of the streetlights, his shadow falling over Mitchell as the man turned, confusion flickering across his face before recognition dawned. It was not violence for the sake of violence that followed. It was precise, controlled, the movements of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of combat. Mitchell found himself on the ground before he could shout, his arm twisted behind his back, the pressure applied with just enough force to bring him to the edge of pain without breaking him. Chuck spoke few words, leaning down, letting Mitchell see his eyes, letting him understand the promise that was being made. If you touch another innocent person, if you think you can hide behind your badge, remember this moment. Mitchell was left on the ground, breathing heavily, fear in his eyes as Chuck disappeared into the shadows, leaving him to grapple with the realization that the world was not as safe as he believed, that there were consequences for actions taken in arrogance. Carter's moment came 2 days later, in the parking lot of the gym where he spent his evenings boasting about his power. Chuck waited until Carter stepped out, wiping sweat from his brow, a smug grin on his face as he looked down at his phone, distracted, unaware of the presence moving toward him. Chuck's hand closed around his wrist, twisting, pulling, disarming him of the small knife he carried in his pocket, the blade clattering to the ground as Carter's knees hit the pavement, a shout of pain echoing in the quiet lot. Chuck leaned down, his voice calm, his eyes cold, reminding Carter of the woman he had harmed, of the life he had endangered, of the child who would grow up with the memory of a mother's pain because of his actions. Chuck walked away, leaving Carter gasping on the ground, clutching his arm, the fear in his eyes a promise that he would remember, that he would think twice before raising his hand against another innocent. Each night, Chuck returned to Gina's side, sitting quietly, holding her hand, whispering to her of the days to come, of the safety he was building for her, for their child, of the home they would return to when she woke. He saw the faint movement of her fingers, the slight flutter of her eyelids, the small signs that life still fought within her, that hope was not lost. And as the city moved around him, unaware of the silent war being fought in its shadows, Chuck continued his hunt, methodical and precise, a promise of justice moving through the streets, ensuring that the world would remember that there were still those who would not allow the innocent to suffer without consequence. The quiet of the hospital room had settled into Chuck's bones, a silence that hummed alongside the rhythmic beeping of the monitors keeping Gina alive. Each evening, he returned to her side, washing his hands in the sink outside her door, stepping in with measured breaths, sitting down beside her to take her hand, speaking softly about the day, though she could not answer. Sometimes her fingers twitched beneath his, a flicker of presence that kept hope alive within him. The swelling in her face had gone down slightly, but the bruises remained, dark shadows across skin that had once been vibrant, her hair brushed carefully by the nurses so that the tangles would not pull against her scalp. She lay still, her breathing mechanical, the rise and fall of her chest a reminder that she was still here, fighting in the quiet, unseen battle that raged within her. He sat with her, remembering the way she laughed, the way her eyes glowed when she saw something that made her happy, the gentle strength in the way she moved through the world. He let those memories fill him as he spoke softly to her, telling her how the world outside kept moving, how the sun still rose and set, how their child was growing strong within her even as she lay in that bed. He told her that he was keeping them safe, that he would keep his promise, that she was not alone. His thumb traced circles against the back of her hand, grounding himself in the warmth of her skin, letting the soft beeping of the machines match the steady rhythm of his resolve. When visiting hours ended, Chuck left the hospital with a nod to the nurses who had begun to recognize his silent presence, who offered him tired, understanding glances as he moved down the hallway and out into the night. The cold air hit his face as he stepped outside, his breath fogging in the darkness as he walked to his truck, sliding into the driver's seat with the practiced movements of a man who had trained himself to move without wasted effort. The engine rumbled to life beneath him, the headlights cutting through the shadows as he drove, the city lights flickering past like memories of another life. He drove to the edge of the city where the lights thinned and the roads grew quiet, pulling into the parking lot of the gym where Carter liked to spend his evenings. The building was closed, the last patrons trickling out into the night, the hum of conversation fading as they walked to their cars. Chuck parked and waited, watching from the shadows, the darkness his ally as he tracked Carter's movements, noting the way he stretched his shoulders, the swagger in his walk, the casual way he checked his phone, unaware of the eyes that followed him. Carter had healed from their last encounter, but the fear remained in the stiffness of his movements, in the way he glanced over his shoulder when he thought no one was looking. A man who knew that he had stepped over a line and that there were consequences waiting in the dark. Chuck waited until Carter moved toward his car, the parking lot nearly empty, the hum of the street lights buzzing softly in the silence. Carter fumbled with his keys, dropping them, cursing softly as he bent to pick them up, giving Chuck the moment he needed. He stepped forward, his boots silent against the pavement, his hand reaching out to grab Carter by the wrist, twisting it with just enough force to send the keys skittering across the asphalt. Carter froze, his breath catching as he looked up into Chuck's face, the recognition and fear sparking in his eyes before he could speak. Chuck's other hand closed around Carter's shoulder, spinning him around, pressing him against the cold metal of the car, the movement controlled, precise, every ounce of strength focused and held in check. Chuck leaned in, close enough that Carter could hear the calm in his breathing, could feel the promise in the silence that stretched between them. Carter tried to pull away to speak, but Chuck's grip tightened, a warning that there would be no pleading, no excuses. He did not speak because there were no words needed. The message was in the steel of his gaze, in the unflinching calm with which he held Carter pinned against the car, in the weight of the silence that pressed down around them. Carter's breath came in short, panicked gasps as Chuck slowly eased his grip, letting him turn, letting him look into the eyes of the man who had come for him, the man who was not afraid, who carried with him the quiet promise of retribution that could not be escaped. Chuck stepped back, his eyes never leaving Carter's as he raised a hand, pointing a single finger at him, a silent command that spoke louder than any threat could. Remember, never again. Chuck turned and walked away, leaving Carter trembling against the car, his breath fogging in the cold air, the fear sinking deep into his bones as he watched the man disappear into the shadows, understanding that this was not over, that he would carry this fear with him every time he reached for his badge, every time he thought about raising his hand against someone weaker than himself. The night was quiet as Chuck drove away, the hum of the engine steady beneath him, the road stretching ahead into the darkness. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph in what he had done. This was not about vengeance. This was about balance, about restoring the promise that had been broken when Gina had been left bleeding on the pavement. It was about ensuring that those who believed themselves untouchable would understand that there were still consequences in the world, that there were still men who would stand against the darkness. He returned home, stepping into the quiet house, the shadows stretching long across the floors, the memories of Gina's laughter and the warmth of her presence filling the silence. He moved through the rooms, checking the locks, the windows, the security systems, ensuring that the world remained outside, that the space they had built together remained safe. He moved to the garage, pulling on his gloves, stepping into the familiar rhythm of training that had defined so much of his life. The heavy bag swung beneath his strikes, the air filling with the sound of impact, each blow a reminder of the promise he had made, each movement precise, controlled, a conversation between strength and focus. Chuck trained until the sweat dripped from his temples, until his breathing came in steady, controlled gasps, until the fire within him had settled into the calm readiness of a man prepared for whatever came next. He showered, the water washing away the sweat and the grime, the warmth grounding him as he stood beneath the stream, closing his eyes, letting the water run over the scars and memories of battles fought and won, of losses carried and promises kept. He stepped out into the quiet of the night, the city beyond the walls of his home pulsing with its own rhythm, unaware of the man who moved through its shadows, ensuring that the balance was kept, that the innocent were protected, that the promises made were not broken. He dried his hands and sat down at the kitchen table, pulling out the small black notebook, flipping it open to the page where the names of Mitchell and Carter were written, drawing a line through each name with slow, deliberate care. There was still work to be done, still promises to keep, but for now, the silence of the house was a comfort, the quiet a reminder that the world could be held at bay, if only for a moment. Chuck closed the notebook, standing to move through the house, checking on the small room that would one day be their child's, the walls painted in soft colors, the crib assembled and waiting, the promise of a future that still held hope. He returned to the hospital the next day, sitting beside Gina, holding her hand, speaking softly about the progress he had made, about the safety he was building for her and for their child. Her fingers twitched beneath his, her eyelids fluttering, the faintest signs of life returning, of strength building within her as she fought her silent battle. The nurses moved around them, checking monitors, adjusting lines, their movements careful, respectful of the man who sat so quietly beside the woman he loved. And as Chuck sat there, watching the rise and fall of Gina's breathing, feeling the warmth of her hand beneath his, he knew that the world was still a place of darkness, still a place where the innocent could be hurt, where promises could be broken, But he also knew that there were those who would stand, who would fight, who would protect the light even when the darkness pressed close. He had done what needed to be done, without rage, without words, with the quiet, cold focus of a man who understood that justice was not always found in the courts, that sometimes it had to be taken, with steady hands and clear eyes, with the promise of retribution delivered without fanfare, without spectacle, but with the certainty of a man who kept his promises. Chuck looked at Gina, her face pale but peaceful, the bruises fading, her breathing steady, and he made a promise to her once more, silently, a vow that she would never be alone, that their child would be born into a world where there were still those who would stand, who would fight, who would protect. He would be that man, for her, for their child, for the promise of the life they had built together. And as the day turned into evening, as the lights outside the window glowed softly in the darkening sky, Chuck sat beside Gina, holding her hand, ready for whatever would come next. The hospital lights dimmed in the hallway as Chuck sat beside Gina, the evening shadows creeping along the floor, claiming each sterile tile inch by inch. The quiet inside the room was broken only by the measured beeping of the heart monitor and the low hum of machines that had become the steady background of his days and nights. He held her hand gently, careful of the IV line taped against the delicate skin of her wrist, his thumb brushing softly over the back of her hand as he spoke to her, his voice low, steady, like a promise whispered into the dark. He told her about the world outside, how the sun had been warm that day, how the wind had moved the leaves in the trees outside their home, how the city kept moving, unaware that within this small room a man sat guard over the most precious part of his world. Gina's face had begun to heal, the dark bruises lightening to yellow, the swelling fading so that her features returned to the shape he knew so well. Her hair, clean now, framed her face softly on the pillow, and her breathing was easier, stronger, as though somewhere deep inside she was fighting to return to him, to the life that was waiting beyond the walls of this room. The baby still moved within her, the monitors that tracked its tiny heart giving soft confirmation that life continued, that hope remained, that there was something worth fighting for in the quiet hours of the night. Chuck spent the days moving between the hospital and home, keeping the routines that had become the framework of his purpose. Each morning, he would leave her side, giving her hand a gentle squeeze before standing, stretching the tightness from his shoulders, nodding to the nurses who had come to know him, who saw in his eyes the weight he carried, the determination that never wavered. He would drive through the city streets, the hum of the engine beneath him a steady reassurance, the world moving past the windows in a blur of color and light. He would return home, stepping into the silence of the house that still held her laughter in the walls, her presence in the small things she had touched, the gentle order she had brought into their shared life. He would check the security systems, the locks, moving through each room with the quiet precision of a man who had spent his life in readiness. In the nursery, he would pause, letting his hand rest on the edge of the crib, the soft blankets folded neatly inside, waiting. The walls were painted in warm, calm colors, the curtains Gina had chosen fluttering softly in the breeze from the open window. The small room held the promise of a future, the hope of new beginnings, the dream of a life that would be built on the foundation of the love they had shared, the strength they had found in each other. In the garage, he trained, the steady rhythm of his movements against the heavy bag filling the space with the sound of focus, of discipline, of purpose. Each strike was measured, controlled, his breathing steady as he moved through the patterns he had practiced for years, letting the movement quiet his mind, letting the familiar burn in his muscles remind him that he was alive, that he was ready, that he would protect what was his. The sweat would drip from his temples, soaking into the collar of his shirt, the air round him heavy with the scent of exertion and resolve. He would shower, letting the water wash away the salt, the heat, standing beneath the stream with his eyes closed, letting the warmth ease the tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his back. He would dress in clean clothes, simple and practical, and return to the hospital, the day having passed in its quiet march, the light fading as the city prepared for night once more. He would sit beside Gina, taking her hand again, speaking to her of the day, of the small moments, of the hope that lived in each breath she took. One evening, as the sky outside turned the deep blue of twilight, Gina's fingers moved beneath his hand, a soft, uncertain flutter that made him pause, holding his breath as he looked down at her face. Her eyelids trembled, the lashes moving against her cheeks, and then, with a slow, fragile effort, her eyes opened, unfocused at first, blinking against the light, searching. He leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest, the world narrowing to the space between them as her eyes found his, recognition flickering in their depths, a soft, broken sound escaping her lips. Her voice was a whisper, barely there, but it was enough. It was everything. She tried to speak again, and he leaned closer, his hand tightening around hers, tears filling his eyes as he heard her say his name, the word trembling but alive. He smiled, unable to stop the tears that fell, his thumb brushing them away as they slid down his cheeks, his voice breaking as he spoke to her, telling her she was safe, that he was there, that she was not alone. The nurses came quickly, checking her vitals, speaking softly to her as they adjusted the machines, the room filling with the quiet urgency of care. Gina's eyes stayed on him, her fingers holding his as tightly as she could, her eyes telling him everything she could not yet say. The doctor came, explaining gently that she needed rest, that she was still fragile, that they would need to watch her closely, but Chuck only nodded, his eyes never leaving Gina's, the promise in his gaze steady and clear. In the days that followed, Gina grew stronger, her voice returning, her eyes clearing, her body healing as the bruises faded, as the swelling disappeared, as the life within her continued to grow, a quiet, constant promise of the future. Chuck stayed by her side, leaving only when she was asleep, returning with small things from home to make the room feel less like a hospital and more like a place where hope could live. A blanket she loved, a small photo of them together, the soft music she liked to play in the mornings. Each piece was a reminder of the life waiting for her, of the world they would return to when she was ready. They spoke of the baby, of names and dreams, of the nursery waiting at home, of the life they would build, stronger now, forged in the fire of what they had survived. Gina would reach for his hand, holding it as she rested, her eyes closing with the comfort of his presence, the warmth of his touch, reminding her that she was not alone, that she was safe, that they would face whatever came together. Chuck continued to move through the city with the quiet confidence of a man who had kept his promise, who had protected what was his, who had ensured that those who believed themselves above consequence had been reminded of the reality of the world. He did not boast of what he had done, did not speak of the nights spent in shadows, of the lessons delivered in silence, but it was there in the way he walked, in the calm that surrounded him, in the strength that lived in the quiet of his gaze. The city continued its restless movement, unaware of the man who had ensured that justice had been served, that the balance had been kept, that the promise of safety had been restored. Chuck moved through it, returning to the hospital each day, bringing Gina small comforts, speaking to her softly, holding her hand as she healed, as she grew stronger, as the light returned to her eyes. And one morning, as the sun rose over the city, casting its warm glow across the world, Gina was ready to go home. Chuck helped her into the wheelchair, the nurses smiling as they watched her sit up, her face calm, her eyes clear, the strength in her posture a testament to the fight she had won. He walked beside her as they moved down the hallway, the light from the windows falling across them, the promise of the day ahead alive in the quiet between them. They left the hospital, stepping into the sunlight, the air fresh and warm, the world bright and alive around them. Chuck helped her into the truck carefully, his hand steady on her back, ensuring her comfort, his eyes meeting hers with a smile that spoke of the relief, the gratitude, the love that filled the space between them. They drove home together, the city passing by, the world moving forward, the future waiting. At home, Chuck helped her inside, guiding her to the couch where she could rest, bringing her a cup of tea, the warmth of the house wrapping around them both as they sat together, the quiet of the space filled with the promise of the life they would continue to build. He moved to the nursery, letting her see the room prepared, the small crib waiting, the soft colors welcoming, the hope of new beginnings alive in every detail. Gina reached for his hand, holding it tightly, her eyes meeting his with the promise of tomorrow, with the strength of survival, with the quiet, unbreakable bond they shared. Chuck smiled, sitting beside her, his hand resting on her belly, feeling the soft movement of their child within, the promise of the future alive beneath his touch. They sat together in the quiet of the home they had built, the light of the day falling across them, the world outside moving on as they remained in that moment, alive, together, ready for whatever came next. Chuck knew that the world was still a place of darkness, still a place where the innocent could be hurt, where promises could be broken, but he also knew that there were those who would stand, who would protect, who would fight for the light. And in that moment, with Gina's hand in his, with the promise of their child between them, Chuck knew that he would continue to be that man, that he would protect this family, this promise, this light, for as long as he drew breath, for as long as the world turned, for as long as there was a tomorrow to protect. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next videos for powerful stories and share this one with someone who needs to see it.